welcome to the Bible for worship here at St. Paul Lutheran Church on this third Sunday in Advent, when our scripture reading is written in the prophet Isaiah, chapter 35, verses 1 through 10. The wilderness and desert will rejoice, the wasteland will celebrate and blossom like a crocus. It will indeed blossom and celebrate with a most celebratory shout. The glory of Lebanon will be given to it, the honor of Carmel and Sharon. It will see the glory of the Lord and the honor of our God. Strengthen the weak hands, steady the staggering knees. Say to the trembling-hearted, be strong, fear not. Here is your God. Vindication draws near, God's fulfillment. God draws near to save you. Thus blind eyes will be made clear, and deaf ears will be made to hear. Thus the Lamb like a ram will bound, and the tongue of the mute will resound. Indeed, water will erupt in the wilderness, and streams in the desert. Parched earth will become a pool, and thirsty ground, springs. The haunt of jackals, an oasis, and grassland, a stand of reeds. There will be a high road there, that is, a way. It will be called the way of the Holy One. Nothing that defiles will pass along it. It is God's. Treading it, even fools will not go astray. No lion will be there, and beasts will not intrude on it. Nothing will be found there, but the redeemed will march along. Those the Lord has rescued will return. They will come to Zion with a shout, crowned with perpetual joy. Exultation and joy will arrive as grief and groaning fly away. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. If these images and phrases sound familiar to you, absolutely. These are familiar images and phrases from other parts of Isaiah in particular and of the Bible in general. They are a summary of themes that are in the Isaiah book. That book includes material that extends from the prophet Isaiah, son of Amoz, in Jerusalem in the mid-8th century BCE, all the way down to the 5th or 4th century BCE, when the book was finally compiled in its present form and sent out into the world. In that mid-8th century setting of the prophet, there was a major crisis in the nation, in Jerusalem, in Judah, to which the prophet responded, and there was an unexpected, nearly miraculous escape or salvation for the people in that moment. And the power of Isaiah's word of the Lord, the power of that moment of God's redemption of the people, was such that down through succeeding generations, the phrases, the images, the themes of that moment continued to carry forward for biblical Israel, renewing generation after generation God's promise and the people's faith. Those themes, which we see here in chapter 35 of Isaiah, are the theme of creation and its constant renewal and recreation by God, of the Exodus and God's redemption of the people, rescue of the people, originally from Pharaoh in Egypt, but from other things as well as years went by, and the return to Zion, the goal of God's bringing the people out of Egypt in the first place in order that they might come to that place which God had selected as the place for God's temple, as the capital of God's people, as the place indeed where God had chosen to make God's name itself to dwell. We see these three themes in the 10 verses of this reading. First, with creation and recreation in verses 1 through 7. We can see it in this language about the revival of the desert, the blossoming of things in the wilderness places and wastelands. This connects perhaps in biblical Israel with the fall festival of booths, as we know it, or Sukkot, as it's known in Hebrew, and the fall rains, which soak the ground during that season of the festival of Sukkot. This desert wasteland south of the Dead Sea, which for so much of the year is a barren, dry, difficult, forbidding place, does spring into life with greenery and colorful flowers. It's that kind of renewal of nature that Isaiah is depicting here. And along with it, the healing of human impairment. If the barrenness of the land is a kind of natural impairment, the healing of the blind, of the deaf, of the lame that Isaiah describes is a similar kind of renewal or healing from human impairment. And who within the Christian community, knowing the stories of Jesus, who cannot think of what Jesus said to John the Baptist disciples when they asked him, "Are you the one who is to come?" And he said, "Tell John what you hear and see. The blind see, the lame walk, the deaf hear." Echoing exactly these kinds of images of God's promised renewal in the human realm as much as in the realm of the nature of natural creation. The second theme that appears here in verses 8 and 9 is the theme of the Exodus. The language that there will be a high road there, a way, it will be called the way of the Holy One, reminds us that when Israel came out of Egypt, they traveled on what was known as the King's Way or the King's Highway, up along the coast into the Promised Land. And here it is not the King's Way, but indeed the way of the Holy One, not of the King, but of God in God's self. This is the Holy Highway. And it represents, as much as it does a physical highway of a physical exodus, certainly at one time referring to Israel's coming back from exile in Babylon, but it also represents for Isaiah, even after that, a path from suffering and oppression and slavery to freedom and autonomy as God's people, freedom to worship God. It's the end of the kind of systemic threat that Egypt in the early days and Babylon in the later days represented to biblical Israel. This is a way out of systemic oppression. The third theme that we see here comes up right in the last verse, verse 10, as that highway leads specifically to Zion, to Mount Zion. And it is those whom God has rescued, the redeemed, who traveled along that holy highway and who now come to Zion. Zion, the original aim and destination of those who came out of the Exodus in Egypt. Zion, the place where God's temple and name are. Zion, the place where all life for Israel gets re-centered. Re-centered in worship of God at the temple, re-centered in the Torah or teaching of God, which Isaiah has said in chapter 2 that teaching will go forth from Zion. Zion is where it is re-centered. And the re-centering of Jewish life around worship and Torah, and the active embodiment of being God's priests, God's people, God's witnesses in the world. All of this is wrapped up for biblical Israel and for Jews in an ongoing way here in this chapter 35 of the prophet Isaiah. And for those of us in the Christian church who read this on the third Sunday in Advent, who anticipate the coming of one who leads us on that highway, who is the Lord of all creation, and who has the teaching of God in his own mouth. For us, it says that just as God promised and was faithful to Israel, so in the coming of Jesus, all people can know God's grace and God's renewal. That's what we wait for this Advent. That's what we look forward to. New creation, a new exodus, and a return, a recentering of our lives around this one who is to come. God bless.